This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Bandits and Bad Magic by Lesley Herron. Chapter 19, Taxodium. After 3 days of being forced to breathe in the smell of decaying flesh, Errik's thoughts that he'd grow accustomed to it eventually began to slip away. 3 long, grueling days, and he still couldn't manage to walk on his own. Whatever had happened, the magic he had somehow summoned had left him drained to his very core. Bob, always eager to lend a hand, had carried him the entire first day as Errik drifted in and out of fitful sleep. Once he'd gained the composure to stand, he opted for walking in hopes that the light exercise would help him speed his recovery. But his constant fear of stumbling over the jagged rocks or slipping into the rapids of the river forced him to accept the support of a putrid shoulder with little complaint.
I'm bored. This is boring. Let's go fight more people in dresses.
Errik sighed, choking a little on the gagging smell. They're robes, not dresses, Wraith, and I'm in no shape to fight.
Then you entertain me. Do some magic.
The thought of trying to control even a flea-sized shadow made Errik's insides churn. No.
Fine. Let's fight your friends then. Should be fun.
What? No, I'm not gonna pick a fight with anyone. Did you not hear what I just said?
Not the little one, though. He's mean. We would lose. Fight the big one. He's weak.
Apparent that the little shadow bug wasn't listening, Errik turned his attention towards Varen. The prince had kept his distance ever since the ordeal in the forest. Yeah, that's not gonna happen. Even the glances shared between them had been brief. In fact, their longest interaction had been the embarrassing moment when they had to help him out of his borrowed and blood-stained clothes. Not his proudest moment, as he and the prince sat shivering by a fire while Evan struggled to wash the garments in the river. Since then, whenever Errik caught Varen looking his way, it was always with a mixed expression of concern and distrust.
Do something.
I just don't have the energy for anything, Wraith. Still another thing Errik had yet to grow accustomed to, the constant presence of a tiny internal shadow creature in his mind.
But I'm bored!
An odd sensation rippled through Errik's body, like that of something kicking and screaming against the inside of his skull. A child throwing a temper tantrum in his brain. It caused him to recoil, and he nearly stumbled.
Bored!
The pain washed over him in waves, showing no signs of subsiding. Fine. Okay, will you stop behaving like a little brat if I do? The little bug didn't respond with words, but the pain in his skull faded. With a heavy sigh and a roll of his eyes, he screwed up his focus and turned his gaze on the nearby dancing shadows of a swaying cattail-like reed. Doing magic was the lesser of all evils, as outright attacking his friends would most likely be physically impossible at this moment, and also incredibly rude. He strained his mind, willing the shadows to cease their movements. The fear of Wraith throwing another tantrum caused him to force his way past the pain building in his body. The thin, black tendrils slowed, becoming sluggish before falling out of sync with the reeds.
Not as fun as I thought it would be.
The ground beneath Errik shifted violently, and he collapsed to his hands and knees as his vision blurred. A searing pain shot up from the pit of his stomach, followed quickly by a dry heave and a mouthful of bile tinged with blood. Hey, are you okay? Errik collapsed to one side, breathing heavy. He blinked several times as the pain dissolved, returning the world around him back into sharp focus. The tiny merc was standing over him, uncorking a water skin with a worried expression. He took the flask, gargling a mouthful of water before spitting it out. Yeah, just... He even struggled with lying at this point. The smell got to me. He motioned towards Bob with a finger. Evan studied the doctor for a moment before he offered him a hand to help him up. Do you want us to wait, or can you walk a little bit longer? It's only midday, but we can make camp for the night if you need. Errik forced his muscles to work just enough for him to settle into a sitting position. Thanks. I'll be okay. I just need a minute. All right. You know I'd offer to help if I could do more than just hold up a kneecap. Evan glanced over his shoulder at the place where the prince had been standing moments before. And Varen? Well, I get it. Don't worry. Evan shook his head. I think you should have a talk with him. Errik waved away the suggestion with a weak gesture. Later. Maybe after I'm able to stand without the help of a walking corpse. No offense, Bob. He looked up to his gruesome traveling companion. The two sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, waiting for Errik to recover. Evan wanted to broach the subject once more, of explaining the urgency for the two of them to sort out their differences, when his thoughts were interrupted by the strident sound of clapping. He turned to see the prince, slapping his hands together to get their attention before gesturing in the direction they had been headed, followed by signing the words tower and here. Oh! Evan tapped against the doctor's shins. I think he found what we was looking for. Think you can walk a little bit farther? Errik nodded with a meager smile. Yeah, you two check it out. We'll be right behind you. The tiny merc needed no further prompting and was off, jogging to catch up to the prince. In the moment Errik reached a hand out to Bob to pull himself to his feet, he caught Varen staring at him. There was something so familiar yet foreign about his brotherly concern. The look lingered for a minute before the prince turned away and followed the tiny merc around the tree bend.
I told you we should fight him.
Will you give it a rest? Errik braced himself for the putrid smell as his faithful, stinky companion slid back underneath his arm. He knew the tiny merc was right, that he did need to have a talk with Varen, but it would have to wait until he no longer felt like sleeping for a week. Since their departure from Still Harbor, whenever Errik imagined the Infinite Tower, a grandiose castle came to mind, one filled with buttresses and ornate architecture that rose for hundreds of feet. It would be adorned with gargoyle waterspouts and barred shut by massive iron gates. Instead, he stared up at a dilapidated and crumbling single-stone tower in the middle of a yellowed field of overgrown weeds. It couldn't even be qualified as a tower at all. The structure was only 15 feet in height, with a faded clay-tiled roof that angled up into a lopsided point. It was plain and unassuming, a crooked thing that was so mundane and ordinary, the only curious thing about it was that it had no doors or windows. Errik slid off Bob's shoulders and slumped against the remains of a hollowed-out log. This can't be the place Atlas told us to go. Unless, of course, if the Arcanist sent them on a wild goose chase when informing them of this place. They hadn't been on the best of terms at the time. Hello? Evan circled around the building, calling out as he did. Anybody in there? Rapunzel? He came around the other side to stop in the shadow of the building. He looked over at the doctor and shoved his hands on his hips. I don't get it. How are we supposed to get in? There was a tapping sound of chalk on a slate, and Varen held up his suggestion. Is there any way in at the top? Evan shook his head. I checked the whole way around. You can see it from down here. There's nothing. I don't know how we're supposed to get in, short of a battering ram. His voice died away as the thought began to roll around in his mind, picking up speed. His eyes shifted back towards the forest behind them, and a wicked smile grew across his face. How long do you think it would take us to chop down a tree? Errik stifled a chuckle as he shook his head. We're not going to make a battering ram. Look, let's just set up camp here for the night. He gestured with a meager wave of his hand at their surroundings. It's as good a place as any, and maybe we'll get lucky. If this is some sort of bustling school of wizardry, someone is bound to come in or out of that thing. Eventually. In truth, he had been leaning more towards the idea that Atlas had simply been having his last laugh, sending them off into the middle of nowhere to an abandoned grain silo. But he heard a rustle to his side and flicked his gaze over to Bob in time to see his demeanor shift from docile dog into a threatening beast, then back again. Oh, I thought I'd find you lot here. Errik twisted around against his log, his mouth going slack. Speak of the devil, and he shall appear. Atlas? Evan bounded over to greet the Arcanist, but skid to a stop as the man stepped out of the shadows. There were several deep purple bruises on his bare chest, and his robes were filthy and stained. A recent wound bled freely on his face, just below his eye patch, and his hair was disheveled. Dude, what happened to you? Even his normally pale skin appeared to be extra peaky in the bright sunlight. Atlas stopped and looked down at his exposed injuries before letting out a bark of disapproval. This? It's nothing. Just a rough couple of weeks is all. Nothing I can't handle. Tilting his head to peer around the Arcanist, Evan noticed something else out of the ordinary. Where's Barry? His smile faltered, and Atlas shifted his gaze to his feet. Like I said, it's been a rough couple of weeks. We had a bit of a disagreement, and well, we're taking a short break. He cleared his throat with dramatic effort and glanced back up. Anyway, I heard a rumor that the Lost King called down unholy beasts and eternal darkness on a group of religious zealots just north of Sharmore. I figured it had to be you guys headed for the tower. Atlas looked around at each member of the group, stopping when he spotted the king slumped against a fallen log, and slowly approached him. Look, I said some things back there, and... He sighed a little. Well, I'm not proud of what I did. I was thinking only of me wallet, and not about what was best for any of you. I'm sorry, too. I shouldn't have taken you for granted. We never would have made it even this far without you. Errik held out a hand. Friends? Atlas hesitated for a heartbeat, but he reached out and clasped the king's forearm. I like the sound of that. Just one question, though. Did you send us here as a prank? Errik pulled his hand away to gesture back at the tower. There's no way in. You just have to know where to knock. Atlas pushed his fingertips together to create a viewing square in front of his face. He peered through the opening, and several of the bricks of the tower glowed in his vision. An illusion spell. There it is. He dropped the spell and reached through one of the fake stones. Errik couldn't summon the energy to be angry at the sight of the Arcanist reaching through what appeared to be solid stone. He had grown to accept the idea of magic, but it still irked his logical mind. They heard the clunk of something metallic, and the stone base of the tower began to rumble. One after another, a section of bricks began to shake loose and fall free, revealing a wooden door beneath. As they hit the ground, they bounced and rattled into position, forming a small stoop leading up. Atlas pulled his hand back and smiled. "Well, after you." Errik took in a deep breath through his nose. He wasn't sure why he was surprised. This was a school of magic, after all. Of course, even their front door had to be a form of showboating.
"That was awesome!"
Evan darted up the small set of stairs and pressed against the door. It swung open to reveal the most mystical, dank, moldy broom closet he had ever seen. "Seriously, man? This is just a cleaning cupboard." Atlas stuck his head in and looked around. "What the heck? Must be a new security feature. Let me try again." He ushered out the tiny dwarf and shut the door behind him. He sucked on the end of a finger before he began drawing a sigil against the wood. He muttered under his breath, and, at the end of his chant, blew through the rune, causing it to dissolve into the hard surface. He licked his lips as he pushed against the metal handle once more. A heavy, resounding clunk of massive metal gears echoed out as they shifted into place. Errik's curiosity piqued, and he reached out to Bob, the two making their way towards the Arcanist. The door swung open before him, allowing a beam of light to spill out and envelop them all in a glittering, warm glow. Evan needed no prompting and was the first to dart in, leaving the others to pile in behind him through the squat entryway. As Errik straightened up, his jaw dropped at the cathedral-sized foyer. The outside appearance of the tower belied its true nature. The entrance hall alone was easily as large as the field they had just left behind. At the deep, echoing sound behind him, he turned to see Atlas forcing the door closed. On this side, the door itself was well over 20 feet in height, with thick bands of metal plating and massive wooden support beams. This thing could easily withstand an incursion of tanks. Atlas moved ahead of the others and turned, spinning on the spot with his arms held aloft. "Welcome, my friends, to the Infinite Tower." The Arcanist's words echoed off vaulted ceilings held up by massive pillars, each one wreathed in row after row of flickering candles. There were tall windows dotting the far walls, hidden beneath moth-eaten curtains in deep shades of maroon. What bits of sky outside that could be seen through the tall panes was dark and dotted with stars, despite them having just stepped in out of the afternoon sun. There was a roaring fire crackling in a grand stone hearth, flooding the room with warmth. Atlas dropped his hands as he turned back to the group. "This is the birthplace of the greatest magical minds for the last 1,000 years. There's not an Arcanist alive that hasn't called this place home at least one point or another. It is the central hub of magical education and experimentation." He sucked in a deep breath through his nose as he closed his one good eye. "Wow!" Evan gasped as he nearly fell backwards, trying to take in the colossal size of the foyer. He blinked several times as he looked around. Thick layers of dust coated the hard tile floor, and many of the candles had burned themselves out, leaving waxy puddles at the base of the pillars. Cobwebs danced on gentle breezes across a faded mural ceiling and around small cracks in the filth-stained windows. He pulled a face, turning to the Arcanist. "So, where is everybody?" A frown creased Atlas's brow as he looked, noticing the severe lack of students and the overwhelming presence of dust. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when he heard the sound of shuffling feet and low mutterings. He spun on the spot until he was facing a long corridor off to the right. At the end of the hall, he watched as a doddering old man, dressed in faded wizard robes, a limp hat, and fluffy slippers, walked across the hall, tittering to himself as he pushed open another door. The muttering stopped, and the old man backed up into the hallway, turning his head to peer at them with large, suspicious eyes. Atlas chuckled and raised a finger, calling out to the old man, "Professor?" The old man gave a disapproving grunt and continued on his way as if he had never stopped in the first place. Atlas, feeling a touch annoyed at being ignored, followed him at a jog. "Oi, Professor!" Evan and Varen exchanged a glance with Errik, who sighed and nodded. "Go ahead, I'll catch up." He watched them dart ahead of him as Bob began to lead him off down the darkened corridor. It's fine, he thought. Just leave me alone in a strange castle that's bigger on the inside. Even with Bob's help, Errik found it difficult to keep up with the others. The group would disappear at the end of one corridor, only to reappear in a completely different hallway behind him. It was a never-ending maze of twists and turns, traceable only by the footprints left in the thick layers of dust. He caught up to the group just as they came to a stop in front of a large arch. A green glow emanated from within, bathing them and the hallway in an eerie light. Atlas hesitated as he watched the professor disappear into the glowing room beyond. He couldn't recall this place, despite having lived here for the better part of a decade. And, while new additions were by no means uncommon, it was best practice not to step into a glowing room unless you know what is causing it. In a place like this, it was unwise to assume anything. But when the tiny dwarf strolled right past him, he let out a sigh of resignation and followed. It was the cold that hit him first. The room was soaked in freezing temperatures, like being teleported to the Arctic Circle. It looked like nothing more than a standard classroom, but the desks and chairs had been replaced by frost-covered shelves and barrels. The glow emanated from a series of runes permanently etched into each wall. A glacial charm? "Professor V, please!" He turned to see the old man standing near one of the bookshelves and was piling a nearby platter with an assortment of foods. "It's Headmaster now!" The old man didn't turn to face his pupil. Once satisfied with the contents of his meal, he snatched up the platter and shoved past the kid. He stepped through the stone arch, annoyed that he had been followed. He spun and leveled the leg of a cooked bird at the Arcanist. "And that's Headmaster Wilfred Willicke von Viserbing III to you, boy." "Really? What happened to Headmaster Epprix?" Atlas licked his lips at the sizable chunk of food being waved around his face. "Or for that matter..." He paused and looked around to note that they were alone in another long, dusty corridor. "Where is everyone else?" Wilfred grunted and pulled back his arm, tearing into the bird leg with ferocity. "Gone!" he shouted, spraying his student with bits of food. He turned on his heel and began marching back down the hallway, grumbling once more to himself. Atlas dragged a hand across his face, wiping the spittle away with a sigh. He and the others followed the old man's brisk pace until they came to a stop in what he recognized to be the old headmaster's study. He remembered it well, having been sent there almost weekly. There were tables filled with finely etched instruments, bubbling vials of mysterious liquids, and chalkboards that lined the walls, each covered corner to corner with tiny, illegible equations. "What do you mean, gone?" Wilfred dropped the platter on the desk and collapsed into a large, cushioned chair. A puff of dust exploded out, and he coughed several times before breaking off a large piece of cheese. He shoveled it into his mouth and chewed noisily for several long minutes before swallowing. "Gone as in no longer here. Absent.
Not currently present. Good gods, boy, you really are the thickest student I have ever taught.
He picked up a grape.
Speaking of which, where is Bartholomew? He was never far from your heels back before we kicked you out.
Evan blinked and looked up at the prince, mouthing the words, Bartholomew? Who shrugged in response. Atlas crossed his arms. He's gone. Wilfred grinned at the Arcanist, a light twinkling in his buggy eyes.
Thick, yes, but never short for wit. To answer what you meant to ask, the Regent Lord pulled our funding. The other teachers left for richer nations, taking their students with them.
He popped the grape into his mouth, squishing it between his teeth.
I'm fine, by the way. Thank you for asking. You, on the other hand, look like hell.
You're here alone.
Present company excluded? Let's see.
Wilfred mumbled under his breath and began slowly counting on his fingers.
Yes.
Seriously, who's Bartholomew? Atlas looked down at the tiny merc with a heavy sigh. He means Barry. Throwing his hands up as if to beseech the heavens, Wilfred let out an anguished cry of frustration.
Why the brightest student of our era latched on to the dumbest, I'll never know.
Hey now! Atlas jabbed an accusatory finger against the headmaster's desk. I had excellent grades.
Being able to cast spells because of your mongrel lineage isn't the same as learning the theory behind them. Just because your forebears were so...
He violently pushed himself from his chair, causing another plume of dust.
Indiscriminate about their partners does not make you intelligent. You simply exude magic. There is a difference.
For the first time, Atlas felt a rush of heat in his cheeks, but he bit back on his retort and said nothing. With a triumphant grin of victory, Wilfred sat back in his chair. That sparkle in his eye never wavered as he began to tear into his meal, keeping his gaze locked on the Arcanist. Errik sighed. This conversation was getting them nowhere. He cleared his throat. Sir? The headmaster jumped, looking wildly at Errik. Perhaps it was because he had been addressed so politely, something that hadn't happened in some time, but he had just then noticed there were others in the room.
Who are you? How did you get in here?
We're with Atlas? Errik gestured with a wave of his hand towards the Arcanist. Atlas flinched at the statement. Wrenching open the nearest drawer, Wilfred withdrew a large monocle and forced it against his eye. He gave the creature standing before him a once-over before dropping his hands and shaking his head.
Typical. He's been teaching you magic then, has he? Never seen a case of overuse so severe. You're lucky to be alive.
He plucked up a handful of grapes, ready to shove them into his mouth, stem and all.
I like him. He's funny.
Atlas looked between the slack-jawed expression on the king to the insulting criticism of his once teacher. I ain't been teaching him nothing.
Yes, it shows.
Wilfred dropped the fruit back onto his platter with a grunt and pushed himself to his feet once more. He scuttled over to a glass cabinet filled with various bottles containing all manner of colored liquids. He rummaged around for an empty vial and smacked it down near a chemistry station before retrieving a number of dusty jars and sachets of herbs and powders. Atlas, taking note of the headmaster's busy state, reached for the man's plate of food. Without turning around, Wilfred belted out a condemning noise.
Touch that and I'll transfigure your fingers into jellyfish. If you're hungry, you should have brought your own.
Gods, you're still a pain in the ass. Atlas slumped into an empty chair with crossed arms. Sir, we're here because I need to find my brother. Errik slid free of Bob's shoulder to brace himself on the back of the Arcanist's chair. "We have reason to believe he's in a different realm." Wilfred waved him off.
Of course you are. The temporal residue is practically oozing off of you and that short one over there. Mucking about with portals. Dangerous stuff at the best of times. For someone as obviously slow as yourself.
He shook the glass of liquid, tapping in a yellow powder until it changed from a dull gray to an acid green. He then shoved the vial into Errik's hand with only one instruction.
Drink!
Errik's jaw tensed, his mind struggling to catch up to his injured pride. Slow?
Slow, as in not very bright, lacking intelligence, showing signs of stupidity.
Wilfred pointed at the beaker.
Drink! Unless you like having a shadeborn carry you around everywhere. Personally, I think the smell would be enough of a deterrent.
Errik brought the beaker to his lips and took a sip. It was unique, in that it was impossible to explain the taste. It was almost like the feeling one gets after witnessing an obscenity being shouted at a sweet old woman, but also with a minty aftertaste. He was just wrapping his mind around the sensation when he felt the strength begin to return to his aching muscles and tired bones. What is this? He didn't wait for an answer before draining the glass dry. Wilfred grinned and reached for the remainder of his bird leg, tearing off a chunk with his teeth.
Good, isn't it? It's my grandmother's cold remedy. It's mostly absinthe, with a few herbs, a touch of this, a dash of that.
He snatched back the empty flask.
And of course, her secret ingredient, a healthy dose of cocaine.
Errik didn't get the chance to respond when Evan piped in, stealing his words. Wait, you guys have that here? He turned to look at the doctor, fully expecting him to unhinge at any moment. How do you feel? Letting go of the back of the chair, Errik found he was able to stand on his own. He flexed his fingers and nodded. Surprisingly good, actually. Wilfred clapped his hands together.
Excellent. Now that you aren't dying anymore, follow me. I want to get this over with so you can all leave.
Like an overgrown bat, he swept from the room once more, urging the others to keep up. Willing to risk the threat of transmogrification, Atlas swiped the hunk of cheese off the platter and shoved it into his mouth, whole, before following the group.
The reason you should never tamper with interdimensional travel is the inherent instabilities caused by quantum uncertainty.
Wilfred kept his gaze fixated ahead of him, scanning the doors with his eyes as they walked.
The idea that a particle is both a wave and a particle at the same time. Chaos rules the fabric of reality, splitting it into infinite possibilities.
Free from the support of Bob at last, Errik jogged alongside the speedy old man. Right, but superpositioning only exists in an unobserved state. You can lock a particle in place simply by using a device to measure it. The trick is measuring it in two places at once, thereby collapsing two superposition points and creating a bridge between them. Wilfred glanced over his shoulder.
Slow, but perhaps not stupid.
Errik beamed. It was so nice to talk like a normal person again. He hadn't had a decent conversation in... Wait, where did you learn quantum theory? A grin crawled across Wilfred's wrinkled features as he threw open the door and gestured for them to enter. Inside was an old dining hall that looked like it had been renovated into a funhouse maze. Hundreds and hundreds of mirrors lined every surface. Full-length, freestanding panes created winding and chaotic paths. Tiny hand mirrors dangled from the ceiling by fine twine, each one like a glittering jewel. There were framed monstrosities and many wash mirrors adorning the walls. There were even polished metal plates hanging along the backs of chairs and tables, polished to sparkling glass surfaces. The entire room shone with dancing, kaleidoscopic light. He could even feel the palpable energy that crackled across the high walls.
"What exactly do you think magic is?"
Wilfred asked as he followed them into the room, tucking his hands into the pockets of his robes.
"It's all physics in the end. Different worlds, different forces of nature, just like gravity. Some worlds have elemental forces that others do not, but that does not make it any less scientific."
Giving up on trying to count all the mirrors, Errik turned to face the headmaster. "That makes sense. But still, working to prove quantum theory requires some extremely advanced equipment, and from the quality of the technomantic relics I've seen, I doubt you have that capability here. So, how?" Wilfred tapped a mirror as they walked by.
"Simple. We cheat."
Errik watched as the reflection rippled and warped, and he was suddenly staring into the control room of what looked to be a large particle accelerator. The view of the mirror shifted slightly, focusing and centering on a computer screen. Atlas let out a long whistle in awe as he tapped another mirror. "I've never been to the gallery before. You old codgers always did keep all the best stuff to yourselves." An image of a bustling market appeared, but all of the inhabitants seemed to be closer related to dragons than any sort of simian.
"Each mirror is tuned to a different universe. With the right calculations, you can peer into any point of space in the entire multiverse."
Wilfred gestured to a row of smaller mirrors wedged between two large, ornate ones.
"These ones are pointed at some of the more interesting locations."
Errik moved before them and leaned over to peer into their tiny viewing surfaces, tapping each one in turn. The first contained a view of a glittering silver city hidden in the clouds. Winged people rushed about their daily lives on floating platforms. He moved to the second mirror, where he found the view of an underwater civilization hidden in the shadowy depths of an ocean. Luminescent creatures fluttered across his field of view, illuminating a grand colony built from corals and water plants. The last mirror was focused on a swamp, bathed in an afternoon sun. The swamp waters were black, dappled with patches of duckweed, and large, slow-moving beasts cruised across the surface in lazy fashion. Atlas felt a grin tug at his mouth. "When you say any point in space..."
"Before you ask, no. I won't let you use it for anything deviant."
Wilfred approached a particular mirror, slightly separated from the others, as if it was of great importance.
"Some mirrors are tuned to follow individuals rather than locations. This is only done for special interests, given the difficulty. This one, for instance, has been tracking someone for the better part of 50 years. I think you may find it particularly interesting."
Errik pulled his gaze away from the murky swamplands and turned to where the headmaster indicated. He felt something clamp down on his chest, and he struggled to catch his breath. "Why have you been tracking my brother?" It was definitely Vel, not some look-alike. There was no mistaking the gold plates and mismatched eyes, even if he was wearing an odd coat. The cyborg was sitting in an old leather armchair, conversing with someone, safe as could be.
"We're not. I check this mirror daily for security reasons. This man arrived only recently, but as he displays the same temporal residue as you, I merely assume he is your missing sibling."
The headmaster moved his hand across the mirror. Like adjusting a camera, the view shifted to a man who looked almost like Errik, save for the long ponytail thrown over one shoulder and a crisp crimson vest. Atlas's grin fell from his face as his jaw dropped. "Is that—"
"The last king, Elias Folkgrave."
Of Bandits and Bad Magic is Book 3 of the ongoing series by Lesley Herron. Tune in every few weeks to hear the latest chapter as it's being written. If you'd like to listen to Books 1 and 2, you can find links in the description.
Good morning, class.
Good morning, Professor V.
All right, settle down, settle down. Now, as eager as I am sure you all are to dive into Mervonian rune variations as they relate to Thebius's equation of lunar divination, there is something I must address first. Headmaster Eprix has asked that any students with knowledge about the heinous defamation of the statue of Grand Arcanist Ubraxist in the Western Garden please come forward.
It was Atlas, sir. Marvin, you dirty little snitch. Will I get my hands on you?
Thank you, Marvin. We figured as much. Master Atlas, would you please report to the headmaster's office? He is expecting you. And for the record, it is not anatomically possible to bend that far, nor is that orifice flexible enough to achieve such a feat.
Tried it then, have ya?
Why, you little...
Later, losers.
Gods, I hate my job.